Coming up, an interview with Chris Duffy, who's the curator of the Duffy Archive. And it was his father, who was an incredibly famous photographer during the 60s and 70s. And probably his most famous work was the cover of the Aladdin Sane album.
He started doing fashion designs. He learned how to cut and make garments. He was part of a group of photographers that revolutionized the visual alphabet of photography in the 60s. Yeah, Duffy took the view when he dropped out, he had this saying that you have to burn your bridges to move on. Such a simple image in many respects. It's on a white background, but revolutionary in period when you think what was happening. Duffy looked at it and said, no, take that off, wipe that off. Took a red lipstick out of Pierre's makeup box and drew the outline of the flash on David's face and went, fill that in. That one moment in time when Duffy took the picture created a cultural icon.
So don't go away. A fascinating interview with Chris Duffy coming up. Just time to ask you to please subscribe. It helps me and it allows you to hear when I've posted something new on this channel. Okay, first of all, Chris Duffy, welcome. You are the custodian of the Duffy Archive. Can you tell me a little bit about your father, Brian Duffy, who he was and how this archive came about?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me on your podcast. I'm very honoured. And so I am the custodian of the Duffy Archive. And my father was a photographer, filmmaker, artist, painter, social anarchist, an aficionado on jazz, music, food, and to me, an all-round wizard. He was part of a group of photographers that revolutionized the visual alphabet of photography in the 60s with a group of other people that became the swinging 60s, and chronicled photographically all those important people who were the movers and shakers: Vidal Sassoon, Mary Quant, the Beatles, John Lennon, and Michael Caine, many others. So that's where he made his mark in the 60s. And then I guess the image that most people know him for would be his work with David Bowie and in particular, the Aladdin Sane album cover imagery. So that's, in many ways, the archive is in two parts. There's the Bowie part, because Duffy did 5 sessions, 3 album covers with David, and then the rest. He, in the 50s, I mean, coming up through a troubled war upbringing, he got a scholarship to St. Martin's School of Art with the intention of going down the road of being an artist, and very quickly registered his contemporaries, people like Frank Arbach, Joe Tilson, and thought he'd never get up to their mark. So he switched courses and did dressmaking, which kind of suited him because it was full of young, attractive women. And I think he was like the only guy in the whole course. But it stood him in good stead for his future in photography, because he learned how to cut and make garments and understood how they should hang. And when he left St. Martin's, because he was talented artistically painting and illustration, he started doing fashion designs for magazines like Harper's Bazaar. And but prior to that, actually, he'd gone to Paris and had landed a job with Balenciaga. But news came through that I was coming on the scene and he couldn't afford to stay there, so he came back. And then, as I say, pushed his career on illustrating fashion designs. And at one point, when he delivered a brief to Harper's, he saw on the editor's desk a bunch of photographic contact sheets. And he said, "Oh, what are those?" And she said, "Well, they're photographic contact sheets." And he looked at them and realized that actually it would be a lot easier taking photographs than it would be illustrating. So he got a job with a photographer called Adrian Flowers and worked as an apprentice assistant, and then put a portfolio together. 1958 took it, late 58 took it into Vogue, Condé Nast, and they gave him a contract. So initially, most of his work was fashion, as a fashion photographer, but of course, he was adept at shooting portraits. He started bringing advertising in, and in the end, Duffy was a very broad, I mean, his work was very broad-based, from editorial pieces to portraits to fashion to, I mean, advertising. He won a lot of awards for campaigns like Smirnoff vodka, I don't know if you remember them in the late 70s, 77, the Benson and Hedges ads that were revolutionary, really, because nobody had seen ads like that. Thatcher and the government, Conservative government, had mandated that you couldn't have photographs like the Marlboro Man of smoking his cigarettes. And so they had to come up with a new concept. And that concept was very surreal. And so, yeah, his work was very broad. Then in the late 60s, 68, 69, he moved into film. He had seen a play with David Bailey, actually, in the East End called Oh, What a Lovely War. And he bought the film rights for that and ended up producing. He wanted to direct it, but because of the union issues at the time, he ended up producing that movie with a friend that he had known since St. Martin's, Len Dayton, the writer. And then became a bit disillusioned with the whole system of the film industry, the unionization, and went back into photography in about 1970, but then went back to film again, shooting commercials, pop promos in the 80s. So very, rounded career, really.
Just to get to the archive, because, you know, the initial question was around the archive. You approached your father while he was still alive to start creating this archive. How did he react at that time? And how did you approach actually sort of looking into his work and finding out what he'd really done? I mean, where was it all?
Well, Duffy took the view when he dropped out. He had this saying that you have to burn your bridges to move on. And just tangentially, that connects very much with David Bowie, in as much as you look at the characters that he killed off. There was kind of an alignment of thinking with that, you know, burning your bridges. But when Duffy decided that he was going to stop taking photographs, and that was for many reasons. I mean, in the 60s, photographers were very powerful in as much as that they had a definite look. I mean, if I look at photographs, I know immediately a Helmut Newton or a Guy Bourdin or a David Bailey, Sarah Moon. And as the 60s progressed, I think what was the rot in photography was Antonioni's film Blow Up, where everyone thought, this looks like a good wheeze, you know, lots of pretty women, nice gadgets, expensive cars, and more and more people came into photography. And by the time Duffy gave up photography in the late 70s, I think that the power had shifted from the photographer's eye to art directors and fashion magazine editors who were determining the way, you know, they had the power. And also the money wasn't there that was there in the early 60s. And Duffy became disillusioned. He was shooting a lot of, he kind of got on this treadmill where he'd got a studio with a secretary, 2 assistants, and he had to keep this whole thing running. And so he ended up doing quite a bit of advertising, which he hated doing. And one day he just flipped and decided he was going to burn all his negs. and went into the garden, built a bonfire, started throwing all these negs on the fire, and by luck, someone had complained. I mean, it's probably something you've never done, is burn film, but being plastic, it produces a lot of black acrid smoke, which wafted down the gardens. And somebody called the council and said, you know, stop this madman with this bonfire. And someone from the council came round, looked over the garden and said, you've got to stop that. So luckily he didn't burn everything. He burnt quite a bit of stuff. So that was the end of his photographic career. And he moved on then to film. And then when he gave up film, he'd always had an intense passion for furniture. And when I assisted him from 73 to 79, I'd set up the shoots, the lighting, and he'd be out the back. He had a big workshop out the back, and he'd be making things, always making furniture, or and also things that we'd use in sets. I mean, today it's very easy. Everyone shoots on a green screen, and you can put a background in. All Duffy's work is analog. There's no digital. So he had a fundamental understanding of lenses, perspective, set building. So, he then took up restoration as a career after he'd stopped making films. And interestingly enough, he managed to get into an association called BAFRA, the British Antique Furniture Restoration Association. There's only about 80 or 90 members, and it's very difficult to get into. And he ended up lecturing to professors. I mean, his depth of knowledge on furniture was well, not just furniture, on so many things was extraordinary. But part of that process, because he passed on finishes, antique finishes. So he was working with a lot of chemicals, and he contracted pulmonary fibrosis, which you've only, prognosis of that is maximum, like you've got 5 years to live. And I had said to Duffy for many, many years that he had this incredible catalogue of work that should be documented, and he really wasn't that bothered. I mean, you know, if you look at other photographers of the period, like David Bailey had, like, every year put a book out. He was brilliant at self-promotion. Duffy was not really interested in that, and bit by bit he kind of started to go off the radar. People of his generation knew how important he was, but a new generation of people coming in didn't know who he was. And I felt it was part of my mission to get his legacy back up and running. And like I say, I'd said to him for years that we got to put something together in the archive. And his view was always, well, it's all yours, old love, when I fall off the perch. And I said, yeah, but Dad, you know, you got all this background, all this information. I need your help to do this. So when he was diagnosed, he realized that it was a finite limit that he had left. And so he started coming into my studio every day, and we started going through all the negs and looking through stuff. So that gave him a real lease of life, and it was a fantastic experience.
Was it also an experience that allowed you to get to know him better at the end of his life?
Yeah, I mean, I'd always been very close to him. I mean, I'm the oldest of four. And so I was always very close to him. After I stopped working for him in 79, I set off on my own path and photographed my contemporaries. So the people like Spandau Ballet, Sade, Steve Strange was a good friend of mine, like Young Cannibals, Ultravox, that whole kind of 80s generation. But I'd always been very close to him, and I'd learnt my craft through working with him. And interestingly enough, when I decided that I would leave him, and I thought I'm going to go and I have to work with another couple of photographers, and I worked for 3 or 4 photographers and realized very quickly they couldn't teach me anything. Duffy was such a broad skill set, from we were shooting on half frame cameras to plate cameras, the 120, our own color processing, did all our own black and white printing, tungsten, flash. I mean, it was a really good grounding. So that set me off. But the experience of putting the archive together was fascinating because he hadn't looked at any of this work. I mean, it had been under the stairs in a cupboard, what was left anyway. And I spent about a year going through negatives, contact sheets, trying to put them together and scanning them to see what we had. And then once I'd collated all of that and I got him to come into the studio, we started looking at what would be, for an exhibition, what will be the images we want to use. So we started grading them from like 5-star down. And of course, Michael Caine, John Lennon, 5-star, you know, so we went down. And I would show him the scanned contact sheets and we go through and he'd go, I'd say, that's a good picture there. Why don't we do a limited edition of that? And he'd say, yeah, it's good, but it's not a great picture. And through that process of a couple of years of going through everything, I really got into his head of what he would choose. And I think now he's not with us. I mean, we've got racks of contact sheets on the wall there. I can open up a book and I can probably tell you the picture that he would choose. So I'm very in tune with what he would have wanted. But I suppose I'm very lucky in as much as that I assisted him and I was a photographer. I think many archives are picked up by, you know, stepsons, daughters, uncle, you know what I mean? And they don't have a connection with it.
I mean, you said earlier about that you could instantly tell a Helmut Newton photo, you could instantly tell a David Bailey photo. What are the tropes of a Duffy photo?
Well, it's interesting because Duffy worked for Elle magazine for 20 years, starting in 1963. And when we were putting the archive together, we didn't have any of the Elle work. And it's interesting because the French have a very different copyright system there. The artist is the owner of the copyright, even though the magazine buys the film, the photographer owns the copyright. So I contacted French Elle and I thought this is going to be very difficult to try and get all these images back. As it turned out, they were very accommodating. It was fantastic. I went over to Paris and they said, we've got racks and racks and racks here, all these magazines from when Elle first started, because it was twice a month. So I think, I'm not sure the exact year when Elle started, but there was like 1,000 magazines there. And they said, we're happy to sort the images out, but we don't have time to find them. If you go through all the magazines and identify which pictures are Duffy, we will then try and find all the transparencies and names. So I spent a week in Elle going through. And what was so interesting was that magazines changed over the years in terms of how the legend work. What I mean by that is in some magazines, you'd have a double page spread and bottom right, it would say photo Duffy. Other years, it would be at the beginning in the index. Other years, it will be right at the beginning of the feature. So I had to go through every page. And I got to a point where I looked at a picture and I went, that's a Duffy. I'm sure that's a Duffy. And I flicked through and lo and behold, somewhere it would say photo Duffy. Now, I can't tell you or explain what that is. It's just a look. When I look at it, I go, that's a Duffy. There's something about the composition, the style, and it's inexplicable.
You mentioned I think it was 5 shoots and 3 album covers for Bowie, yeah. But of course there is this absolutely iconic image that we all know, the Aladdin Sane cover. What do you know about how that actually came about and what David's wishes were and how that all materialized in the studio?
Well, remember, David wasn't a superstar at that point. I mean, the Svengali behind that was Tony Defries. And Tony had picked up David in the Ziggy period. and had this vision that he was going to make David a superstar, obviously recognized his immense talent, and put together a plan of how to do that. Tony had known Duffy from just after Duffy had, as I say, moved out of film. And when, actually, interestingly enough, when Duffy produced Oh, What a Lovely War, his vision after that was to unionize photographers and try and get them as part of the ACCT. And there was an association called AFAP, which looked after photographers. And Duffy had brought in Tony into that association to try and negotiate bringing photographers into the union. In the end, it all fell apart. Photographers didn't want to do it. But that's where Duffy first met Defries. And then, as I say, Tony had picked up David. And of course, Tony was looking for a killer image, a key image for David. And he put David on a test shoot with Duffy, David Bailey, and Sakita to see how David would react and work with them, what the chemistry was. And of course, it was natural. David and Duffy connected immediately. They both had the same similar views on things, their connection with art, music, history, politics. And Duffy was, I suppose, a social anarchist. That would have intrigued David as well.
Don't go away. Chris will be back with more about the Duffy Archive in just a second. But just time to ask you to please subscribe. It helps me and it allows you to hear when I've posted something new on the channel. So let's get back to the interview with Chris Duffy, the curator of the Duffy Archive.
Bear in mind, Duffy was about 10 years older, so kind of David saw him a bit more like a fatherly figure. And so their chemistry through those 5 sessions was very much about David. And it wasn't just with Duffy. I mean, as we all recognize, David was brilliant at understanding other people's talent and how he could harness what they brought to the party. I mean, look at Mick Ronson, Carlos Alomar, Mike Darson, all these people that elevated David's vision, you know. And so David understood that he wasn't a photographer, but he understood that if he gave Duffy an idea, he would produce something brilliant. I mean, Aladdin Sane was really such a simple image in many respects. It's on a white background, but revolutionary in period when you think what was happening. And it left so many questions to be asked about it. Was it a death mask? Was it, I mean, a surreal Dali representation? What was it really about? But when David came to Duffy, after the first test shoot with the Ziggy pictures, as I say, they connected. Tony realized that Duffy was the man. Duffy asked David what the next album was to be called, and David said, Aladdin Sane. And Duffy reworked that as Aladdin Sane, which of course is not a word. And the only idea or concept, which was David's, was the Flash. Now, the Flash, David had lifted from Elvis, because Elvis had started a brotherhood. It was called the Templars of the Christian Brotherhood, which fought racism and anti-Semitism. And he'd compressed that into an acronym TCB, taking care of business, in a flash. He had a ring with a flash on. The tail of his private jet had the flash on. He gave his band signets with the flash on. And David was fascinated with that flash. And if you look at the early Ziggy gigs, there is a kind of crude representation of the flash on Woody's drum kit. So when Duffy and David were discussing the album, Aladdin Sane was what Duffy heard. And David said, and I want to use this flash. Now, it wasn't really agreed on how was that going to be used, that flash. On the day of the shoot, the makeup artist, Pierre La Roche, who was not Duffy's first choice. Duffy wanted to use a fashion makeup artist called Barbara Daly, who wasn't available. And the previous Wednesday, Duffy was doing a shoot, and the makeup artist was Pierre, and Duffy urgently needed a makeup artist and said, "What are you doing Saturday?" And he was available. David had used, and again, if you look at pictures prior to Aladdin Sane, a little symbol of an anchor on his face, like a little tattoo. Pierre started the makeup, they discussed the flash, and Pierre put a little flash on David's cheek. Duffy looked at it and said, "No, take that off, wipe that off." Took a red lipstick out of Pierre's makeup box and drew the outline of the flash on David's face and went, "Fill that in." So yeah, that's really how that came about, really. Interesting enough, also, just before Duffy had put the outline on, we had in the studio a rice cooker made by National Panasonic that my grandma had given him. And the logo was a red and blue flash. And Duffy showed that to David and said, "Is that the kind of look, flash, color?" And they agreed it was. So the kind of concept of that coloration came from the rice cooker, and the rest is history, really. I mean, I look at it and think that one moment in time when Duffy took the picture created a cultural icon. And there's no way that you can go out and say, "Today I'm going to go and do something like that." It's about timing, place, everything, all the constituent parts of the jigsaw come together. So we're very, very lucky, fortunate to have that image.
I mean, you mentioned about what connected Bowie and Duffy, and what I find really fascinating is that obviously from both sides, they both liked being challenged at the moment, because a lot of it came together at the moment. Do you feel that was part of it, this sort of essence of challenging each other brought out the best in each other?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Duffy was, as I say, he was a social anarchist. He was contentious on every level. He liked to push buttons in people because he was fascinated essentially about what made people think what they thought. So he always wanted to drill down, and he was very adept at being able to argue black is white and white is black. I mean, he would argue things he didn't even believe in just to get people to react. Assisting him for many years, I could see when he was doing portraits that, and if you look at the contact sheets, you can see that people have forgotten they're actually even being photographed, because they're engaged in a mental game with him, a conversation, and you see people in the contact sheets going, not realizing they're being photographed. So that connection that Duffy and David had was about challenging all these different ideas and pushing each other. I think they were both very much of a like mind. Yeah.
Why do you think that image is so significant even today? Is it to do with timing as well? Is it to do with, the era and the change of societal values and everything that sort of Bowie seemed to represent as well?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I think it was outrageous, in terms of, if you think back where we are now with sexuality, for example. I mean, it's right across the board. In 1973, David he produced an image that said, it's okay to do this. You can be who you want. And that challenged the social norms, I think. And people didn't quite understand it. Youth grabbed onto it and went, "Wow, what is this all about?" I mean, it's rebellious, it's unconventional, it's mysterious, it's enigmatic, and it had an emotional connection, I think. And you could be who you wanted, even now when we do exhibitions, if we do a Bowie exhibition, you see people turning up with the flash on their face. It's become such a powerful symbol. But as I say, I mean, everything in life is about timing, and I think it's also stood the test of time. It looks as contemporary today as it did then. We had an exhibition in Los Angeles, and we had a big Aladdin Sane as the key part of the exhibition hung. We had a couple of riggers from New York, and they hung this picture up, and one of them stood back and he went, "Yeah, man, nice Photoshop work." And I said, Photoshop didn't even exist then, right? Okay, but you know, there's a contemporary connection that people still have today, and every day I look at that image and I never get bored of it. It has a resonance, and all great art does that. It speaks to you. You can't explain it. It just either touches you or it doesn't. And Aladdin Sane has a very wide appeal, you know, through the generations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said about that moment in time, I mean, for me as a 13-year-old in 1972,
Yeah.
Unsure of my sexuality in an era where it wasn't acceptable, it was somewhere which represented to me, this is where I could belong, which is an even more powerful type of idea. A whole generation had that feeling that David Bowie was sort of saying, come to me. You know what I mean? It was amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you know, that is the key, the jewel in the crown for the archive. But the other sessions, I think what's really interesting about Duffy's work with David is that it encapsulates this period, which, for want of a better phrase, I would say is the golden years, because it goes from Ziggy, where David's found his feet after many years of trying all these different things, bands like Feathers, you know, all these incarnations that he had. But Ziggy was like the beginning of the liftoff. Duffy came in at that point. We have Aladdin Sane, which is the jewel in the crown and the cultural icon. Then David shifts to Young Americans, The Man Who Fell to Earth, which Duffy covered. Then Lodger, and then finally Scary Monsters. And that sort of was the end of when David really kind of utilized theatrical characters. And so that encapsulation of Duffy's work is a really interesting progression. So we put that together in a book called 5 Sessions, which I put together with David's biographer, Kevin Can. And it tells the story of all those the people who were there on the set, doing the makeup, doing the filming, whatever. So, yeah.
One thing that really fascinates me with this is that you yourself became a photographer a bit later. And I know many people who have had very famous parents, fathers or whatever, and have sort of lived in their shadow. But it does seem to me that almost like this archive has given you your identity through, in a sense, as well. It's sort of the way you talk about it. It makes me feel like you've created an identity also for yourself, which is really fascinating and interesting and very positive.
Yes, I mean, I never envisaged I would be running the archive. My career from 79, when I was photographing people like Adamant or, you know, and then I moved in Bow Wow Wow a bit later, and all these people that were my generation. I had a career that was, and it's interesting because Duffy's work was, as I say, very broad. And he said to me, you're going to be the last of a generation that will work like that. And I was lucky enough to work in music, fashion, beauty, advertising. I did the same thing. And that working for him gave me a great understanding of how to work with people and understand people, because people in the fashion business are completely different to people in the record business. So I had my career, and then 86, 87, I moved into film. But coming back to the archive, that connection of understanding Duffy's philosophy, his work, having been a photographer, has given me a whole new career. I wouldn't say it's identified me, because I think I already, in myself, had my own kind of direction and identity. But I think It's something that I never envisaged I was doing, but it excites me to put exhibitions together and look at this work and get a resonance from an audience. You know, people, I really get off on people enjoying the work because I love it so much that I want to share it and put it out there for other people. So yeah, I'm very privileged to do that.
I mean, you mentioned at the start with the archive that there was a generation that obviously knew his importance, and
Yeah.
that was slowly diminishing because of the time going by. How have you seen, you know, with things like the V&A, the Bowie exhibition at the V&A, with things that you have done with the archive, how have you seen that growth now in new generations?
Well, certainly the David Bowie Is exhibition, 2013, turbocharged Duffy's recognition because part of our agreement was we had to have copyright notice on everything. And of course, the 11 venues around the world that it went to, the key image was the eyes open, which interestingly enough, I mean, hadn't been, the only image that had ever been seen was the eyes closed. It was only when Kevin Can came to me and he was doing his book Any Day Now, and he said, I'm doing it up to 73. Have you got any more pictures of Aladdin Sane? And I said, yeah, come to the studio. And I put them out on the light box, and his eyes came out on organ stops. He couldn't believe what we had. And he saw the eyes open and said, can I use that in my book? And I said, well, if David's okay with it, sure. Yeah, why not? And of course, then the V&A picked up on that as the key image for David Bowie Is. And as it went round the world, we saw our web stats like go insane because everyone, well, I say everyone, a huge amount of people know the Aladdin Sane image, but not that many people know Duffy's name or the person who took it. So I can only imagine that people saw the copyright and went, Duffy, oh, who's that? And then checked our website out. So yes, it certainly turbocharged Duffy's worldwide recognition. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
What for you, out of all the works that your father has done, what do you think is central to his legacy?
Well, of course, Aladdin Sane has to be. I
Right.
mean, it is the most, it's a cultural icon, and every photographer in the world would give his back teeth to have that image. So yeah, there you go. It is now today, in fact, it is the 51st anniversary of the Aladdin Sane album.
Yeah, and this book came out, I think it was last year, wasn't it, on the 50th?
Correct.
And
Yeah.
it's an amazing book. And there are, I mean, in a sense, it was what's surprised me was the amount of photos that are taken before the choice of the last image is chosen
Yeah.
from, you know, from the Aladdin Sane. And you can, you know, obviously from the cover, you get that idea that this
Yeah.
is sort of a collage of photos and that you're choosing one essential photo. How important was it that Duffy had already had this company for him to have more control over what he was doing rather than being sort of like a photographer to hire? He was much more of a sort of force in a sense.
Yes, I think that came around really because Duffy was disillusioned with his work going to designers in whether record companies or other advertising agencies or wherever, where they would put something together that didn't show his work in the way that he wanted it to be seen. So I think he thought if he had his own design company, he'd have control on the cropping, the text, the layout, the whole concept. So that was his idea, really, and it was called Duffy Design Concepts. So it was just really about having complete control. And I think in the end, that's what all artists want. Not that Duffy would see himself as an artist. I mean, he never got up in the morning and thought, today I'm going to go out and create great work. He was a gun for hire and did it in the best way that he could. You know, there's to really see and understand the character. your listeners probably should check out on our website the BBC documentary called The Man Who Shot the 60s. It's an hour-long documentary. It's fascinating, and BBC replayed it like half a dozen times. It was incredibly popular, and we were so lucky that we managed to get all this in the can just before Duffy passed away. But it does give you an insight into the man and his thinking, and you can see to him it was just a job. He did it the best that he could. He didn't place any other value on it. It was always for other people to make that judgment.
When you met Bowie, didn't you? You were in the studio and your father hadn't quite arrived. You were early.
Well, no, what happened was when I first met David, I was still at home. I was 17, and Duffy had this ritual on a Sunday morning of, he got sent records all the time from record companies, and he had a ritual of playing records really loud in the living room on a Sunday morning. And I came down and I heard this music blasting out, and I stopped and I thought, well, I mean, this is always the difficult thing, you see, when you've got a parent that listens as a teenager to stuff that you do. That's a bit disconcerting, because every generation rallies against its parents and wants to create. And when your dad's playing something you'd listen to, that's, yeah. So I went into the living room and I said, that's great. Who's that? He said, it's a guy called David Bowie. I went, wow, that's brilliant. Can I borrow the record? He said, yeah, as long as you don't scratch it. And he said, I'm doing his next album cover. Do you want to meet him? And I said, yeah, of course. He said, come to Trident. I'm going to meet him at Trident Studios, 7 o'clock Tuesday. Be there. I went down St. Anne's Court, Trident Studios, knocked on the door. I opened the door and I said, oh, I've come to see Duffy. He said, oh, they're in there. And Trident Studios, the reception's really, I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's really quite hokey and small. And so I went over to the door on the right, knocked on the door opened, and David opened the door, and he looked me up and down and he said, who are you? And I said, oh, I'm Chris, Duffy's son. He said, you're Duffy's son? I said, yeah. He said, your father is a lunatic. He said, come in. So I went in, and at that moment, Mick Ronson was down in the studio behind the glass window with his gold top Les Paul and a pair of head cans on. Ken Scott was behind the mixing desk. And they were doing the overdubs to Let's Spend the Night Together. And David said, sit down, have a seat. There was a big sofa there. I sort of disappeared into the corner and listened to them doing the overdubs. And of course, unlike today where everything's digital, when they used Ampex tape, it was all what? They'd rewind it back and do it. And Mick would do an overdub. And whenever I listen to that track on the album, I'm totally back in the studio. But yes, no. So I mean, David used to come round until that point where he went to the States. Shortly afterwards, he'd come round to dinner on a regular basis, and then, of course, Duffy connected them again on The Man Who Fell to Earth, and then Lodger when David had come back to Berlin, and then the Scary Monsters shoot. By that point, Duffy had actually stopped taking pictures in '79. And Duffy said to me, David wants to do another album cover. I went, oh, okay. What's that got to do with me? He said, well, I don't have a studio. I don't have an assistant. I'd set up a studio in Little Russell Street. And he said, can we use your studio? And I said, yeah, okay, fine. And I'll assist you. So we shot the Scary Monsters shoot there. And it was quite, I say chaotic. Duffy had introduced David to a painter called Edward Bell. And so Edward was commissioned to do the painting, of which was initially going to be from Duffy's photographs, but Edward wanted to do his own thing. So Duffy took photographs. David said he needed press photographs, so I did the press photographs, and then Edward did his photographs. So it was kind of a bit of a mad mashup. And of course, the makeup started off with a brilliant makeup artist called God, my brain's gone. Richard Shara. who'd done this beautiful Vogue. I mean, David wanted to be the most beautiful clown in the circus. That's what he said to Natasha Korniloff, who made the outfit. And those first pictures were David looking absolutely amazing. And then we pulled all the makeup off and roughed his face up. So it was kind of 2 sessions in one with 3 different people taking pictures. And as always, nothing was that straightforward with Duffy. It was always something was going to be interesting on the shoot.
What are the plans for the archive coming up?
The plans, well, since COVID, which had a massive impact worldwide on all galleries, all museums, I think we're only just starting to get back into some semblance of normality. Remember, museums, for example, are 18 months, 2 years ahead. So all those things that they had scheduled have either been dropped out or then rescheduled. But in truth, last year, the 50th anniversary of Aladdin Sane was just insane here. I mean, we had the book launch, we had a special edition launch, we had a big exhibit at the South Bank, which was incredible. I mean, they wanted to extend the show. They couldn't get enough people in. They extended it to like 8 at night, and that was massively successful. And then we had the 5 sessions, a museum show in Madrid for 3 months. And so that really took a toll. It was exhausting. So this year I've decided I need to kick back a bit and get my breath back and look at what we're going to do next year. We've got plans. Those will be put on the website. Anyone who signs up to the website, duffyarchive.com, will, on our mailing list, will announce what we're doing. But this is kind of like a fallow year, really, just to get my sanity back.
Well, I hope you do. It's been fascinating talking to you. And I do have to say, I mean, I just loved going through this book. It was also what you mentioned for you about meeting Bowie and going back to that time. This took me back to my youth.
Yeah, I think when I put that book together, we knew we had to put something together for the 50th year. And we were the only people, obviously, that could do it. Was that I thought I would take a leaf out of David's book and harness other people's energy, because I thought I'm not a writer. For me to put something together would be very biased. And I thought, why not take the top 5 Bowie writers, Nicholas Pegg, Jerome Seligny, Charles Sean Murray, Paul Morley, and Kevin Can, and give them 2 songs each. And then that would really give it such an interesting flavor. And then wrapped in this coating from Jeff Marsh, who's, from the V&A, brilliant social historian who's put everything in context. I thought that would be the way to present it. And so I just oversaw the whole project. But and I think it came out pretty good.
Yeah, well, thanks again for bringing your father's work to life, because there is such importance, historical importance in his work, and I look forward to what you're going to do in the future, Chris. Thanks very much for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews, and here is where you can connect.